Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Word on the Snake Vine. I'm your host Ross Deacon, and on this podcast we talk all things about venomous animal related, from venom research, venomous animal husbandry, animal conservation, herping, and of course snake bite and snake bite initiatives all around this world. On this episode, I have joining me as my co-host.
Hi, I'm Denny.
Hey, I'm Squirrel.
Hi, I'm Edd. And before we start, I have to do a few formalities. Any views expressed in this episode are the views of the guest host, not for the facility or the company they work for.
And today we have our first episode away from venom and venomous research, and we've got Matt Goode joining us today. How are you today, Matt?
Doing great, thanks.
And today we're going to talk about different bits of pieces about ecology, about Matt's work, and we may even diversify away from reptiles a little bit, because Matt's just mentioned something I didn't realise he did, and I find quite interesting. So, so maybe we can diversify away from reptiles a little bit within this episode. So, Matt, I think a lot of people in Europe, especially, will know you from various talks and stuff around Europe that you've done at different symposiums, the King Cobra Symposium, the recent flagship species symposium, venomous species flagship symposium in Holland. Kind of how did you get into ecology and into reptiles specifically? Kind of how did that develop through into the position you're in today?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who work with snakes seems like it's some kind of fever, that they get when they're really young and they get sort of obsessed with snakes. That wasn't really my story. I grew up in a really remote area in the United States, in a place in northern Wyoming. And, I lived right out in the woods, basically. And I was just outdoors all the time. That was kind of our playground in the Black Hills of Wyoming and South Dakota. So, we caught a lot of snakes, mostly garter snakes, and there were rattlesnakes around there, prairie rattlesnakes, big fins.
Seems to be a common thing with herpetologists is garter snakes. The garter snake seems to be a common theme, because when we spoke to Ray Morgan, garter snakes, when Paul Rowley, garter snakes, you garter snakes, everybody seems to have that interest in the garter snakes.
I'm not sure how much of it is just a specific interest. It is, they're just pretty ubiquitous, Seems like everywhere you go, there's at least some species of garter snake. And when you're growing up in the northern part of the U.S., that's kind of one of the few species in some places, because it's just so darn cold up there. I don't know why people love garter snakes, because they shit all over you when you catch them, which is like not the greatest thing. They smell really bad. And, but yeah, they're still snakes, and they're still cool. So, but I just try to catch anything. Go ahead.
I think that's quite their widespreadness across the US is kind of, and kind of how easy they are to obtain really good-looking specimens in the hobby as well. I think that's kind of one of the big shout-outs for them of being that first snake. They are good at it. Yeah, as you say, they're smelly, but they're hardy because a lot of them are from quite northern up in the US, and so they tend to be quite hardy species as well. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, indeed,
a common thing.
Yeah, there may be some convergence there in Europe too with matrix, I suppose, and maybe even with venomous snakes like Vipera and Crotalus. Also find them in very northern climates, So yeah. So I don't know. I wasn't obsessed with snakes in particular, just being outdoors and all kinds of wildlife. And I didn't really start doing research on snakes until I got into the university and when I was a young lad. And then from there on, I've been on it since, I guess, 1983 or so was when I first had my first job working with rattlesnakes. And it's just kind of developed since then. And, I think it's been, for me, as much about the questions I could ask from a research perspective, what's it like to be a snake and how are they living their lives out there, and as it was about the snakes in the beginning. But now I would say it's probably equal parts, love of the animals and love of science.
I think that's quite a common thing with the academic community. I think a lot of people have moved into it from slightly differently to you, where they've come from the love of the animal into wanting to research. Where I think you've seemed to, from what you've just said, posed a different side of that, where you've kind of gone, how do they live, where do they live, kind of, and you've come into it through asking those sets of questions, which is
Yeah.
quite interesting. So in 1980, you said in 1983 you got your first project with rattlesnakes. What rattlesnakes did you? What was that project about? And you talk a little bit more about that, or?
Yeah, that's really where I cut my teeth in herpetology. I was at the University of Wyoming, and we studied a really high elevation population of prairie rattlesnakes, Crotalus viridis. And I was lucky enough to get in with a really well-known, brilliant herpetologist, really a behavioral ecologist by the name of Dave Duvall. And, he had some great grad students, and I was able to work with people like Gordon Schuett did his PhD with Dave, and Bill Hayes, and, some other people like that. And it was just a really good environment. And I worked with Dave for several years, and, was able to work on some projects, publish some papers, do some of my own work. And it was just really, really fortunate, and that just kind of solidified it in me. And then I just sort of kept going down that path, I guess you could say. So got lucky, really. And it was just like a work study position, and I remember they were advertising it, or everybody who would come, you had to go to this office, right? And you had a work study grant in the United States means that the government, if you're poor enough, the government will give you a little bit of money and you can get a job and work in somebody's lab, and the government will pay for most of it, And I just would usually wait until the last day and get some crappy job. And I went in there, and this lady was like, "Hey, how would you like to take care of a bunch of rattlesnakes?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll take that," And she was just shocked, because apparently she'd been asking everybody who came in the door for the entire week, and everybody's like, "Are you kidding?" So I did that, and that was kind of the rest is history.
I think if you're studying them anyway, probably looking after a small collection, or it may have been a large collection of rattlesnakes, probably something that you would snap somebody's, as you did, snap somebody's hands off.
Yeah, prairie rattlesnakes, these were wild ones. Nobody was doing really much with them. They were in these big, giant containers that Dave had built, and prairie rattlesnakes are kind of pissy little guys. They're bitey, and I remember throwing mice in there, and they would just like go after them, and you had to stay there and watch them, because if one of them would strike a mouse and start to eat it, it was likely that another one might slither up there and get on the other end, And in fact, that happened one time where one snake just kept going and actually ate the other rattlesnake. And when I came back, it was kind of a mess. But yeah, there must have been 30 or 40 of them just kind of in these big, giant containers. It's probably I doubt you could even get away with that nowadays, but we didn't have the same animal care guidelines and stuff back then, I think. And but that led to field work mainly. That was just his sort of captive colony that he was trying to do some behavioral stuff with. And but mainly what I did was work out in the field with him at a long-term study site where I worked for about 6 summers, living out of an old sheep wagon and doing some of the first telemetry ever done on rattlesnakes, and following these things around. They were moving incredibly long distances, sometimes up to 15 kilometers out away from their den sites. Den sites sometimes would have like 600 animals in one den. And it was a really cool time in my life, and, a lot of time to be out there in the middle of nowhere chasing some snakes around. It was pretty exciting.
That sounds like a really interesting bit of a study, actually. Being able to say 15 kilometers, that is quite a distance.
Yeah, we were kind of the first people to find that out. That when you get rattlesnakes living in some of these really low productivity environments where it's really cold. For example, there were less than 90 frost-free days per year. So these rattlesnakes would have to come out of the den and get everything done, mate and feed and mate and do everything, and before they had to go back down in the den, like not long after that. So it was probably about 2,500 meters or so elevation, and it was just a really, they were really living on the edge there, I guess you'd say, Ross, you know? And it was interesting to see some of these extreme life history strategies that these snakes had to do in order to survive in that environment.
Yes, it just seems mad, as you say, with less than 90 frost-free days a year. So they need to hit the den in the evening, otherwise, reality of them surviving the night would be pretty slim in some cases.
Well, no, actually, they only overwintered in the den, right? So they had a very extended overwintering period. Once they came out of the den, peak egress from the den was around mid-May or so. And then they would kind of hang around the den for a while, and that's how we actually captured them by the hundreds. And then they would go out and go on these long migrations, basically, and they were actual straight line migrations, and we noticed that right away. And literally go 10, 12, 15 kilometers away from the den, essentially on straight lines. You would have a hard time walking a line that straight yourself with a compass, and of course we didn't have GPS units back then. And it was really fascinating, and we were trying to understand what were the mechanisms that allowed them to be able to move on these straight line vernal migrations. And then when what they would do is, once they would encounter an area where you had locally active population of deer mice, that you would start to find them in these ambush postures, and they would feed, and then they would eventually find some females which didn't disperse as far and mate before they had to get back down in the den. It was all a very compressed activity period.
That's quite interesting, because I know you've done some work, obviously some more telemetry work on different species since then as well, which we'll probably get onto. But 15 kilometers for a very short period of activity, that seems massively far for such a small animal as well.
Just, can we also touch on how many you said you found in the den? Did you say over 600 in the den?
Yeah, so one of our main den, we had 3 or 4 dens that we actually studied fairly intensively. I actually designed this big sort of box trap that you could put over the den opening, and in most cases the den openings were quite small. It was just like one small crevice, and the snakes would come out of there, and they would kind of come out to bask in the spring, and you'd get 30 or 40 of them around this den. And you could catch them before they could get back down, because they would sort of, in the mad dash to try to get back into the den, it was kind of a big log jam, and you could just sort of grab as many as you needed. And by having that box over the trap that you could open from the top, they couldn't disperse away from the den. So we could clean out that entire den that way over a 2 or 3 week period. And so we could actually directly enumerate closely the number of animals that were in the den. We didn't even have to estimate it with mark recapture, because we pretty much had their only exit hole pretty well covered,
That's a lot of animals in one place.
Yeah, we would collect about 30 a day, and that's how many we could process. And it was really still cold at night then, so we had these huge garbage cans that we buried into the ground, and we'd put them in there, and we'd run a generator with the light on top of them so they could kind of stay warm. And then we'd process them all the next day and go catch a bunch more. And yeah,
it sounds like good fun, actually.
It was. Yeah, it was kind of a rodeo, to be honest, a snake rodeo, because those frickin' prairie rattlesnakes were, all they wanted to do was latch onto you, So yeah, it was interesting.
I assume that there was no accidents during that time, and you came out with all your digits.
I came out, I wouldn't necessarily say that was true for everybody involved, but I guess I got lucky.
So when you came on from there, what happened? I'll spit my words out in a second. So where did you kind of move on from there? Kind of where did you go from the prairie rattlesnakes? Did you? I know you spent you've obviously spent a little bit of time in India and such forth as well, doing projects out there.
Yeah, that wasn't until quite a long time later. Basically what I did is I applied for graduate school, and I was going to go on and do a PhD at that time because I really had the science bug at that point, and just felt like that might be a good thing to do. And academia is just kind of like extended adolescence. It sounded a lot better than going and getting a real job, So basically I did that, and I got admitted into a few programs, and I was going to go work in University of Colorado with Dave Chizar, who's a god to me. He's no longer with us, but and then this job opening came up to work on Aruba Island rattlesnakes. And I said, well, why don't I try that for a while? That way I don't have to go straight back to school. So I did that for a couple years and spent 2 years down on Aruba studying crowless unicolor.
I've got a friend with some of them in captivity, and I think they're probably one of the rarest crotalus species there is, isn't there? Well, they used to be.
Yeah, I think they're pretty heavy in collections. When I first went down there, they had a couple the Houston Zoo, and a guy named Andy Odom was in charge of what's called species survival plan for that snake. And he's the one who wrote me into going down there, and they had been there a couple times for several days, and the best they'd been able to do was find a shed skin. And so we were a little bit worried about the snake, and I don't think I actually found one until, I don't know, I think I was down there a good month before I found one. And then I kind of started figuring out where they were, and ended up finding quite a few, and even enough to where we felt like we could export. We exported 10 individuals back into the captive population because it was starting to get pretty inbred. So your friend with those snakes, who knows? They may have some of the genetic signature of some of the ones that I caught out there and sent back to the U.S. Who knows? But
well, I know his ones, I believe, were imported from the U.S. to the person who had them before him.
Yeah, apparently they had a pretty big surplus, I heard, in the captive population. It seemed like every zoo had them there for a while, kind of an ugly little rattlesnakes. I don't know. Some of them are really white colored, which is kind of interesting.
His are really white.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
But again, kind of, was that doing a similar kind of work with tracking and trying to figure out a little bit more about this species, kind of where they were, where they're positioned, where the populations are positioned and such forth?
Exactly. Nobody had ever done any intensive work with them. So I think I ended up with 4 or 5 of them that had radio transmitters in them, and followed those guys around. And oh, geez, that lasted for a couple years. And then they've done since then, Howard Reinert has done a ton of work with that species. He kind of started working down there in 92, I think it was. And I think I had finished up down there in 89 or something like that. And he did a lot of work on unicolor. So, and it's still a species survival plan animal, and I think they're still doing work down there, if I'm not mistaken. They now have boas on the island, and I think they're a little worried about that. But last I heard, they don't seem to be affecting the rattlesnake population, but they're causing problems for, some of the birds on Aruba.
I think it wouldn't be the worst place to be positioned for a few years, would it, in the Caribbean Sea in the sun?
It was some good duty, I got to tell you, man. When I got there, they hooked me up with a really nice little Toyota Land Cruiser, and I had a little beach bungalow house, 50 meters from this incredible beach with coral reef, and it was a good time, no doubt. I managed to just drink massive quantities of beer when I was on the island. Amstel had a little, it's a Dutch island, and they brewed Amstel out of the water that they were able to reclaim, basically get from the seawater, So, yeah, it was good. Then I met this beautiful Dutch woman there, and she's now my wife. We've been married, damn near 30 years now, but Yeah, so it was lucky, man. I'm living a charmed life, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's it. And then I know from there, you did some time in Europe.
Yeah, that's right. I convinced Andrea, who's now my wife, I convinced her to let me come over to Amsterdam with her. She's from Amsterdam, and I lived there for several years. There I was teaching high school, actually. I couldn't really get a good research position that I liked. Nobody was really working with doing the kind of stuff I was doing, and it's kind of hard to break into the Netherlands. Fairly tight knit, within the academic community. So yeah, I taught high school there for several years, and just had a great time. It was wonderful living right in the city center of Amsterdam.
No, it's a very much a beautiful city, but if you're a snake person, probably not the best place to be.
No,
wild
right.
populations of snakes are few and far between in Holland. They are there if you know where to go, but
yeah, I mean, I did have a couple friends took me around. I did see some natrix there, and I've seen adders there on several occasions, but yeah, I mean, it's a cool little country, but it's when you're from Wyoming and you're used to just nothing but pure nature, I remember thinking when I went to the Amsterdam forest or whatever, and it was just like, who cleaned this place up? It looked like somebody went through there and just picked up all the downed, branches that had fallen out of the trees and mowed the yard and stuff. And it was just kind of weird, but you don't live in Amsterdam for that reason. There's other reasons to live there.
Yeah, I think most of our listeners will know those reasons.
Yeah, I bet they will. Yeah.
So that's a little bit different to say Wyoming's probably a little bit different to where you currently live. It's
I live down in Arizona now in the stinking hot desert. Yeah. So but it's nice. It's nice right now. The winters here are lovely. And I'm sitting outside here looking at a vermilion flycatcher. I don't know if you know that species or not.
A flycatcher?
Yeah, they're these just vermilion, bright red colored, beautiful little flycatchers that he's flitting around here. But it's a nice place to be in the winter, and it's a damn good place to be if you like snakes, So yeah, I kind of found a good fit, I guess you could say.
So that kind of leads us on to some of the work that you're currently doing, and some of the work that I've seen you present at a few different conferences. So currently you're doing quite a bit of work with Crotalus tigrinus or tiger rattlesnakes.
Yeah, Crotalus tigrinus.
Yeah, which obviously, as Tucson, which is where your populations are, is expanding. Obviously, it's expanding into these populations, and you're seeing quite different changes in behavior and migration. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much. I wouldn't say they migrate not like the prairie rattlesnakes do, where they have this really strong seasonal movement pattern. But the development, in the Arizona desert, and in particular Tucson and Phoenix, are two gigantic, megalopolises, especially Phoenix, and they're really, the tiger rattlesnake range is kind of centered around these two big cities. So these rattlesnakes, this particular species, are very tied to rocky outcrops at the base of mountains. And, those are some really beautiful places. You have the iconic saguaros, and, people like those places too. So as Tucson and Phoenix have expanded, literally some of the fastest growing places on the planet, some of these things like tiger rattlesnakes, Gila monsters, other of these iconic Sonoran desert species have been kind of getting pushed around. So yeah, I've been trying to do long-term research looking at how they respond to development and trying to get a better understanding of ways we might be able to develop that are a little bit more, I guess, allow maybe for a little bit more coexistence with not just rattlesnakes, but, snakes in general and reptiles in general.
And I think that's where the kind of this episode comes in, is kind of to talk a little bit more about that, and kind of kind of what the work your work is finding around urban ecology, and kind of how some of these especially like golf courses. The example you used was I've heard you use as a golf course. Is that because of the increase in sprinkler systems and greenery around those areas, it's meaning that snakes are obviously food sources for snakes is considerably larger, so you're finding different activity patterns around these kind of areas.
Yeah, indeed. We find with crowless tigris in particular. Now, the site that we've been working at, I've been out there since 2002 when they first built the golf course in 2000, and there were only just a small handful of homes, and now I think they just got over the 300 mark just recently. So
these all big homes for celebrities that want the sun even in the winter.
Yeah, these are some serious trophy homes, I tell you. Some of them are probably third and fourth homes. For example, if I'm not mistaken, the president of the Barclays Bank has a home out there. So we got a UK connection there, But anyway, yeah, they're just huge homes. Some of them literally multiple, $4 or $5 million homes. And the nice thing about them, and I think this was completely, serendipitous, but they build them in such a way that they have large lots around them, and they don't destroy the desert. They only kind of make a pad just for the house. The house ends up kind of blending in with the natural environment around it, and they'll leave some of these rock outcrops. It's a very rocky area. And I think by virtue of doing that, even though the development has expanded, they've left quite a bit of, good open space around there. And the other thing that's interesting about it is the people who live there, for the most part, are only there during the winter months. And you probably know about this phenomenon we have in the U.S. and I'm sure other places in the world where we have what they call snowbirds. And, there are people who live down here in the wintertime, but they get out of here in the summertime when it's, reaches, 48 degrees or whatever. And so when the snakes are active in the summertime, that's when they're most active during our monsoon period. The people aren't really here. So we haven't had a lot of mortality, and it's rare that a snake will get run over on the road, for example. And so these populations have really persisted. And in the case of crowless tigris, where we've radio tracked over 100 individuals and located them literally 11,000 plus times, we've got really solid data on, their movement patterns, their reproductive cycles, all kinds of stuff. I've had a couple individuals that I radio tracked for 12 years, the same individual. And what we found is that tiger rattlesnakes associated with this golf course area where you have, like you said, more this input of water due to irrigation, and of the golf course and of the community or of the homes, like their landscaping, the snakes associated with the golf course are larger. They give birth more often. They have larger litter sizes. So they've really sort of taken advantage of this input of water, which has led to increased primary productivity, and apparently, we actually have data on it, it's led to an increase in their prey. So it's an interesting situation. What's going to happen in the future, we don't know. So far, it's still kind of persisting, And
well, that kind of goes against something you just said there. Goes kind of against maybe a common myth that a lot of people think if there's more predators, there's less prey because they eat each other. However, the prey species will then their clutch sizes will increase naturally to be able to try and keep the species alive. And as you say, it's kind of there's a big circle that's happening there. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I won't go so far as to say that we totally understand the mechanisms that are underpinning what's happening with the tigris. Unfortunately, looking at trophic interactions, trophic cascading, and that kind of thing is a really complicated, challenging thing to do. But we have some ways to look at it further. For example, we know a lot about what the snakes eat because we do diet analyses based on fecal samples. And when I compare it, the beauty of this site is that I've also studied tigress at 2 other sites for fairly long periods of time. And they switch their diet on the golf course, and they eat almost exclusively rodents. I have another site where I studied them where they're about, 60-40 rodents, and another site where they're about 60-40 lizards, right? So they will definitely change their diet based on, it looks like, what's available. And so the comparisons that we're making there are, to other populations. So we have something to compare it to. And it's been a surprise, I guess. You think development, golf course, okay, the snakes are pretty screwed, right? But I think just because of the idiosyncrasies of this high-end development, I think so far it's working out, and we'll just have to see what happens as more and more residents come to live there and you get more and more pressure on the snakes. I know they're starting to put the houses more densely arrayed throughout the development. There's more roads. More and more people are starting to live there during the snake active season. But it's, we're at it now almost 20 years, and we really have not seen a decline in either crowdless tigress or in all the other snakes which make up the snake community out there, which is 21 species. So yeah, it's interesting.
That is
sure. Yeah,
that's cool. 21 species of snake in that, and you say you're not seeing a decline. That is really quite interesting. It's quite it's quite interesting to see how the development, as you say, hasn't actually affected the animals within that region. In fact, in this instance, it seems to be having the opposite effect and helping that. So that's actually quite something quite something that we wouldn't necessarily say happens in a lot of urbanization of areas, of wild-based areas, which is interesting.
Definitely not. Yeah, I mean, the typical pattern, and I mean, obviously there's different types of development, right? If you have this blade and grade development and you take the desert, completely remove it and put in rows upon rows of houses, there's not much going to persist there. But in this case, it may be this input of primary productivity, this increase of, energy that's available to these animals. It can offset any of the negative effects due to mortality or other sort of negative things that come along with humans. And it's been a really big surprise to me. I actually gave a keynote talk at the World Congress of Golf or something like that. It was in where was that? It was up in Scotland, actually. It was at St. Andrews. And I think the golf community was kind of excited about it there. But I said in my talk, look, I don't think we should put golf courses all over the place in order to save wildlife. I have a feeling what may happen is we could be sort of setting up an ecological trap potentially, where we're providing everything the snakes need in order to reproduce and persist. But as the human influence becomes greater and greater, it may actually, the mortality at some point may outweigh the benefits of, increased water and that kind of thing. But it's definitely a long-term process to be able to document those kind of changes if they do indeed occur. And I think ultimately what I'm hoping that will come out of it is sort of lessons learned about how we might be able to develop areas in a way that is more conducive to wildlife. Problem with that, of course, is, if you have a really low density development, not as many people can live there. So you end up with more sort of urban sprawl. Might be better just to build, up right in the middle of the city, right? And leave all of that natural area alone. So
that's something that they're doing. That's something that they're trying to do now in China and areas in Southeast Asia where they're building. They have to build up purely for the sheer amount of people, but they're trying to include certain features within within the homes and the buildings that they're making to try and allow for wildlife, especially in certain areas of China where they have big bird migrations. You may have seen it where they've got the big holes in certain buildings, and buildings are triangular shaped, so the birds will naturally fly one either side of the triangular shape and then can come back together the other side, and they've changed the shape and stuff, which is still quite interesting on some of the things that they're trying to do.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much we can do if we just get a little bit creative about it. It's kind of like this new field that you see popping up a lot, biomimicry they call it, which is a little bit of a weird name, I think, for it, but it's really trying to develop the human built environment in a way that is more conducive to wildlife. And I actually read a study recently here in Arizona where wildlife are actually increased property values, so I don't want to boil it all down to economics. I think we're not going to preserve things like rattlesnakes in large numbers unless we do it just because they have an inherent value, that maybe at the ecosystem level or whatever. But if we boil it down to money, I feel like it could go south on us, so I'm not saying that it economically is the answer, but I think as people are getting more and more associated with, living in cities and less people are rural, a lot of people have no clue about what's even around them, And so if we can develop some educational programs around urban ecology research, then we can reach people who wouldn't be reached otherwise. And I feel like education is ultimately going to be the key, Unless, of course, we just have large-scale ecological disasters and we're forced to do these things, which is maybe the way it's going to go. I don't know, but that's pretty cynical, but probably pretty accurate. So yeah, I'm kind of ambling here or whatever, but it's complicated, and it's been a very interesting area of research, but trying to take what you learn and apply it has been a real challenge.
No doubt. So these golf courses that are seeing these increases in rattlesnake populations, how are they mitigating the snake-human conflict?
I don't think they're doing much at all in the case of this development. They're just letting us be there. We give presentations. We've managed to, cultivate a good relationship with the people who live there. And it's purely just us sort of telling them how cool snakes are. And, people tend to respond to that. But what they're doing to actually mitigate it, I don't know if there are probably no developments out there where they said, okay, let's make sure we leave this corridor here for snakes. I don't think that's happening, but that may be happening from some more charismatic species. Species that a lot of people aren't deathly afraid of. But there are ways to do it, right? We could think a lot more about the way we develop an area, the configuration of that development. And of course, education and things like putting signs up that tell people to slow down. How effective those are, I don't know. I've never done any research on that, but I feel like it needs to happen at the development phase, that it has to happen sort of from the beginning, and trying to retrofit a development to make it more wildlife friendly seems like, an extreme challenge. But if we are thinking about it a priori, I think we could probably do some really amazing things, right? So yeah, direct mitigation techniques, I don't think there's a lot of them. And if they are, they're probably forced by some governmental regulations. If you have an endangered species out on the landscape, you can't just go in there and whack it, and do things which will reduce its survival. So yeah, we have some environmental regulations, but even those are being gutted as we speak. So they're very much vulnerable to the whims of politics.
You mentioned that you've seen a shift of the diet on the golf course rattlesnakes to your other sites. Have you seen any physiological changes from that?
Actually, I have collaborated with Del DiNardo. I don't know if you guys know Del. He's a very well-known Gila monster researcher, and his
I don't
students.
recognise the name. But
Yeah,
Neither do I.
yeah. Dale has done a lot of work with Gila monsters, him and his students, and they've actually kind of glommed onto that same study site because we have an amazing amount of Gila monsters out there. We're up over 700 captures. Now that includes recaptures. So I think it's around 360 individuals that we've recaptured multiple times. And they're very interested in physiological ecology, and so they've looked at things like water loss, and they looked at how Gila monsters will retain water in their bladders, and they've actually compared that to a reference site that does not have this input of human source of water, and found some interesting differences in Gila monster physiological ecology. I haven't really looked at any physiological ecology directly with any of the species that I've been working on and within that snake assemblage. So I can't really say what might be going on there. But Dell and those guys have definitely found out some interesting stuff with Gila monsters. They just have this source of water. So, Gila monsters will tend to retain water in their bladders so they can use it during very dry periods. And that's just not a problem for them out in a place like our development site which is called Stone Canyon, by the way. That's not a problem because there's a lot of sources of water out there. Really changes the entire energetics of the species, right? So I think it probably having profound effects on their physiological ecology.
Yeah, that'd be quite an interesting project to move on to. Obviously,
It would be.
through
Yeah.
time.
I'd like to look more at the mechanistic things behind, for example, the increase in reproduction, larger litter sizes, decreased reproductive periodicity. They're having babies annually. Some of these tiger rattlesnakes are, whereas in the other sites, they were having babies like every 2-3 years. A good physiological ecologist could look more at those mechanisms, and that's definitely fertile ground for research. And it would also, help us get at some of the underlying mechanisms that would help to explain some of the patterns that we're seeing. It's just not an area that I have much expertise in, but I would love to collaborate with whoever might, because I do think that Stone Canyon is a bit of a semi-natural experiment in a way, especially with the densities of some of these animals we get out there. I'd love to see somebody come out there and do like some doubly labeled water, and there's a lot of things people could do.
That's quite interesting. So something else that I think people may know you for, other than the rattlesnakes, the rattlesnake research, is your research on king cobras. That you've conducted. Could you take us a little bit through what you did there and kind of the work that you've undertaken there?
Yeah, indeed. It was back in 2007 when I got a call from Rom Whitaker, and he was looking for somebody to get involved with some research on king cobras. He had recently established his site over in Agumbe. He'd bought some land over there, and he really wanted to, see if he could radio track some king cobras and learn more about them. And so I was lucky enough to go over there, and Ram and I started a project in 2008, and I did the first implants ever on king cobras, which was really exciting. And we started radio tracking a small number of individuals there that we tracked for several years. And we've published some papers. They're not appearing in really high rent journals or anything because the sample sizes are small. It literally takes a team of people to follow these animals around. And so we've that sort of started, and I've expanded it to some other sites now as well.
That would be. I think a lot of people will have seen that this piece of work is where you found that these animals will have massive home ranges and are quite nomadic in a lot of ways of how they live their lifestyles. And I think I can't remember where I heard the story, but I can remember hearing a story about how people were following these kings day and night. Teams are following these kings radio track kings into farms, into houses, through masses of different land types and and different ecosystems as well as they're passing through, and they're quite a bit of an anomaly from a snake perspective. As a snake.
Oh yeah, I mean the king cobras are just mind blowing. We've just seen so many incredible things, and it's all really thanks to Rom and the Croc Bank, and mainly to the people who work out there. When I first got there, Gauri Shankar was there, and Ajay Giri, who's still there now, who does a lot of king cobra rescues, and there's a new guy there named Yatin Kalki who's still tracking these kings along with other people I don't know. I haven't been as much involved in the project recently, but just brilliant people out there just working their tails off to keep track of these kings. And some of the things we've seen, for example, we published a little paper on this one king in particular that ate like 26 pit vipers over a 3-month period, and we got to observe him actually consuming these. The kings are so huge, right? This is a king that's like 4-point-something meters long, and we're staying back away from them when we radio track them, but we can actually still see them doing a lot of their behaviors. And it's just, they do things that you just don't think snakes would do, and it's been really exciting. Just one quick story. A king that we'd seen, and he'd actually envenomated a large Malabar pit viper, and the pit viper fell out of the tree and landed down in the water, and there was a small stream there. The king went down looking for him. He's tongue flicking, trying to find that snake, and actually couldn't find it. Went back up in the tree. You could see him sort of looking around. You could see him actually see the snake in the water, go back down, track it down, and eat it. And it's just like, wow. They're just extremely aware, and these big, active, diurnally active hunters, and it's been a real trip to follow them around. And unfortunately, it's hard to get big sample sizes. So if you go to publish a manuscript and you got 3 snakes, that's kind of hard to do.
Yeah, just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, but we have been able to get a lot of the behavioral data that we've observed and that kind of thing out there in the literature. So, and yeah, it's been really fascinating.
That sounds like it could be a really, really good project going forward as well for the people involved, and hopefully the sample sizes will increase because no doubt these animals probably cross each other's paths semi-regularly for varying times of the year, so that there's chances to increase sample sizes as the snakes find each other effectively as well during mating season and such forth.
Yeah, it's been mostly an issue of not just personnel, but permits. It's really challenging to get and keep permits in India. You have to remember that. The king cobra is a god, right? And it's worshipped throughout this area in the Goombay. People don't kill king cobras, but they worship them.
Well, this is something that a couple of our guests have said, and I think Rom said it as well, that the biggest issue that they have is you can't just go out and track wildlife or find wildlife. If you get caught doing so, especially in certain areas, it's a crime, and then they will punish you for it and stuff.
Indeed. Yeah, there was some fella accidentally ran over one, and he stopped. He was a truck driver, and he ran over this king cobra with his lorry, and there were actually local people there who were kind of like really angry with this guy. Some people were hitting him with sticks and stuff, and they made a funeral pyre and they burned the snake and stuff. So it's serious business, And I'm sure Rom told you there's nobody better to talk to about that stuff than Rom. But it's been interesting. But they're doing really well over there now. I think they still have a smaller number of snakes that they're tracking, but I'm seeing a lot of information. I don't know if you guys follow their Instagram or anything like that, but just some fascinating stuff coming out of it.
We do, and Rom said quite a lot off the phone as well about some of the work that they're doing, that they're just not quite ready to tell the world and such forth yet. And some of the information that they've got, it's absolutely incredible. Yeah, and kind of this moves us on to the time kind of non-reptile related, because you mentioned to us earlier something about tigers.
No, I haven't been doing any work with tigers. Maybe I meant tiger rattlesnakes.
Oh, okay, maybe I misheard you. Yeah, I was really excited then. I was like, "Oh, you're doing some work with tigers?"
No, I haven't. The only thing the only other non-reptile species I've worked intensively with are shrikes. I work on horned lizards, and one of my bigger projects, and we've been looking at horned lizard predation on shrikes. But no, I have not been working on tigers. I've never seen a tiger. I did see a leopard when I was in a Goode, but that's it. That's as close as I got.
I think you must have meant the tiger rattlesnakes and just said tiger,
Yeah.
and my brain went, oh,
Yeah.
now that's quite interesting. Let's bring that
Sorry
up a bit
about
later on, because I have a note here, because I write notes, and I have a note here. He said tigers. Bring that up.
Yeah, that's just what we call tiger rattlesnake. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's because you've done the work in India. I was just like, have you got involved in that as well? And because I know around the Agumbe area is they do have quite a few. From all accounts, they do have quite a few tigers in that area. So,
I think there are. I think there's the occasional. They certainly have a lot of leopards. I know we did find some tiger scat at one point that was pretty fresh, but yeah, you never know what you're going to run into out there. But I'm glad I didn't run into any tigers.
Definitely, that would have been a very hairy moment.
Indeed.
But the sounds of it, because obviously we've not had the chance to go, but Ron was telling us about the Agumbe Research Centre, and it sounds absolutely incredible. Just cool the area it's in and stuff. That's somewhere I would like to, at some point in my life, visit that kind of area of India.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can get out there, you would love it, and especially right now with the radio tracking kings and seeing on a daily basis. Like I just saw a post from Yatin of this king pulling a big common cobra out of a burrow. It's just like we never see that stuff in Thailand, and the reason, I think one of the reasons why. So we expanded our project over to Thailand, and Colin Strine is the guy who runs that project. I went out there originally to help him. Show him how to implant these radio transmitters into pit vipers, but we both were like, we should do a king cobra study, and now we've actually published several recent papers with larger sample sizes of king cobras, and Colin and his students are just amazing.
I have a friend who's just been out there for a year, but not necessarily on the King project, on one of his other projects, but
right.
And he just says that the work he's doing and the work that research centre is doing is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, Ben Marshall's there, and those guys have been publishing a bunch of papers, and they're very, very good scientists, very quantitative. So it's been really a joy to be involved with that, and just kind of, it's kind of from afar. I do get over there. I've been over there several times, but I'm not the lucky guy to go out and track the animals. It's just more, thinking about the questions and publishing the papers and that kind of thing. And so, they've gotten larger sample sizes. But what I started to say there is they haven't been able to observe these amazing behaviors. And that's one of the reasons why that is because they're very keen to not disturb the king cobras while radio tracking. And so they triangulate the locations. They don't actually get visuals on the snakes. They stay further back. So, and that's just because they don't want to, when they're publishing some of their information on movement patterns and stuff, they don't want to be interfering with whether or not, the snakes are moving, that kind of thing.
So are they seeing in Thailand that the snakes are as nomadic? Because obviously there's quite a lot of work going into the reclassification of kings, and I think current thinking that there is either 9 to 14 different species, or one species in different localities. The two kind of the two Gary was saying, the kind of the two strains of thinking is right now. So kind of, are we seeing a difference in the nomadic behavior between the Thai population and the Indian population?
It did seem like, and of course these are still based on fairly small sample sizes, it's really hard to compare from site to site because, the configuration of the landscapes are different and that kind of thing. But it did seem like the king cobras in India were moving more. We haven't tried to really account for body size in any systematic way. I would imagine larger males would move more than any of the others. But yeah, they had larger home ranges. Although there are some snakes in Thailand who have had really massive home ranges. I'm going to say somewhere up in the 1,500 hectare area. So one of the things that we've been thinking of, Ram and I, early on is like, these things are like the tigers of the snake world in a sense, because they move so far. They have these huge home ranges, and they could be sort of a surrogate species in the sense that other large ranging animals are. It might be difficult to get people to have the same, I guess, love for king cobras as it is for something like a tiger or an elephant or a rhino. I don't know, but we've certainly been working at it.
Well, I think king cobras are one of like lachesis or bushmasters. They're one of the species of reptile that are possibly, for a flagship species for conservation, they're probably the two biggest and most recognizable species that would be able to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's this fascination for things like tigers and elephants and stuff, and I think there is for kings. It may be more of a morbid fascination, I don't know, or just outright fear. But
well, it's quite funny because the more people you talk to about snakebite around kings, the more you realise that actually kings don't actually bite many people, unless they are being played with. It's unlike other species that do an exploratory bite and such forth. They don't seem to see that same behaviour with kings, which means that actually bite numbers for kings is relatively low compared to
absolutely.
the other species.
Yeah, like, I don't know, one of the papers that Colin and his team published was talking about that. Like, there's basically no recorded king cobra snake bites in this area. And you guys, you've been around them probably, and I've been around them multiple times, and they put on a hell of a show, but they don't seem interested in biting, which is a really good thing, because when they're hooded up, and they could bite you, in the chest if they wanted to, but for some reason they're very, very reluctant to bite. Now, I'm not saying the king cobras won't bite; they will, and but it seems like the bites are mostly kind of like when you're getting them in a bag or something, and it may just be physical contact or
all these
whatever.
people messing around with them, trying to get them to hood while they've got them in their hands, and it's the bite. All these bites that you see and you hear of always seem like they are very much avoidable, especially with a species as such as that.
Yeah. I do have a lot of respect for Ram and people like Jerry who handle those animals, and Ajay, because they're just really gentle with them, and they can, but they're still on the tail end of a potential disaster, but luckily they just don't seem that likely to bite, at least from that sort of threatening posture. It's kind of interesting. And
you've mentioned a few times about the kind of surgical imputation of the telemetry devices. Can you talk a bit more about the actual device, kind of how long the battery life lasts, and possibly more about the surgery if you can?
Sure, I'd be glad to. The technology's come a long way. When we were first implanting these things in the early 80s, they were about the size of a film canister, if you remember the old film vials, and they were just clearly too big for the snakes, and I think we had some issues associated with that. But now they've gotten smaller. You can get radio transmitters and all the way down to 0.25 grams. But you can also get them clear up to 25 grams, and how large they are is directly correlated with how long they last, because you're just putting more batteries on board. And so when you put one of these transmitters in an animal like a king cobra, if I put a 15 gram, 13 gram transmitter in there, it can last up to 2.5 years. But we'll often catch an animal and replace the transmitter earlier than usual, because you do get premature failures on a regular basis. Telemetry is a wonderful technique. It's completely revolutionized the study of snakes, but it's not a total panacea. You're constantly fighting the battle of, when do I have to take it out? What effect is it having on the animal, and that kind of thing. And, the surgery itself is also obviously very invasive. They seem to tolerate it really well. Snakes are very tough, seems like. We use fairly primitive anesthetic procedures where we just put a snake into a container with some raw, isoflurane anesthesia, and they're able to withstand really deep planes of anesthesia. If you were to do that with a bird or a mammal, you would kill it, But yeah, so one of the things I think we haven't been as good at is really trying to look more closely at what might be negative effects of radio telemetry, whether it's the implant itself or just the daily tracking of an animal. But scientists we want to study what the animals are doing, not what we're doing to mess them up, right? So those kinds of studies are a little bit far and few between, but I still think that radio telemetry, you tend to get normal behaviors, and it is definitely the technique if you want to get really detailed data on snakes, movement data, behavioral data, and all kinds of stuff like that.
So how long do these trackers stay on the snake for?
Well, it all depends on the size. So the typical one that I would put in a king cobra might weigh about 13 to 15 grams and last about 2 to 2.5 years.
So they last a while then. They're not something that will that can be ripped off fairly easily within a couple of, well, they probably can be, but they're not likely to be.
Yeah, these are actually implanted into the coelomic cavity. So it's an internal implant. And we've developed a technique that, that has been around for a while that snake people do, where you implant the transmitter into the coelomic cavity, and then you run the antenna itself. You straighten it out and run it underneath the skin of the snake towards the head. And that way you can get maximum, reception distance on the signal. And so it's a really pretty standard technique that people use. And it seems to work really well. Sometimes you get some migration of the transmitter inside the animal. Occasionally an animal may get an infection, which is obviously problematic, but for the most part, it works really well. But I think animals that have transmitters in them may grow less. They have to put some energy into dealing with the burden of carrying that transmitter around. We try to keep it at, less than 5% of the total mass of the animal. So we're doing what we can, but it's still, an invasive procedure at some level.
It's actually quite interesting how all that works. I think we could probably talk about that for hours. But I have, as always, we are at the end of the time we have to record the episode. So I'm
sorry if I carried on a little too long about certain things, but
I know genuinely that it's been great. Even me making myself look like a fool talking about tigers.
Oh, that's okay. No worries.
It's been absolutely great, Matt. Thank you so much for coming on. And I'd just like to thank our listeners for listening again, as usual. Please like and share this episode. Please also give us a review on our Facebook page and also on the podcasting platforms. More people that review the episodes or review the podcast, the more people will see the episodes as well. Also, I'd just like to remind everybody that wordonthesnakevine.co.uk is our website where all our episodes are available. There is also some merchandise available on the website also, and any profit from that merchandise sales goes back into snakebite charities around the world. And also, we also have a Patreon group. If you'd like to join our Patreon group, the link is in the description. Please do. And any money made on Patreon, again, goes towards snakebite and snake conservation charities also. So thank you very much all for listening, and good night.